Okay, everyone. So it is 6:03 and we will now begin. So my name is Shaquana Baba. I will be the moderator for this week's session. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce to us our distinguished speaker this afternoon. And he will also be the speaker for Thursday's session, no other than Dr. James Fletcher, a leading expert in the Caribbean climate and energy policy. Dr. Fletcher had numerous of influential roles, including the chairman of the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. And he was also the chair of the CARICOM Regional Task Force on Sustainable Development. He is also the founder of the Caribbean Climate Justice Project, which raised awareness of a serious threat posed by climate change and promotes urgent action across the region. As a former minister in St. Lucia, Dr. Fletcher had led significant reforms in energy, water, and information technology sectors on the global stage. He played a key role in the 2015 Paris Agreement negotiation, where his leadership in the 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign was very instrumental in securing critical climate commitments. He is a highly sought after as a keynote speaker, primarily and particularly on the climate change facing small island development states. And we are very honored to have him here with us tonight. So Dr. Fletcher will be presenting on the critical issues of climate change and its impacts on agriculture, a topic that I find that is very incredibly important for our region. So without further ado, I will present and welcome Dr. Fletcher Dr. Fletcher to the floor. But before he begins, I would like everyone to keep their mics muted. All questions will be saved till after the presentation. If you think that you might forget your questions, please place it in the chat and I will read them for you after Dr. Fletcher has presented. So without further ado, I will give Dr. Fletcher the floor. Excuse me, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaquana, and good evening, everyone. It is actually quite an impressive gathering. I'm seeing 99 participants right now, which is extreme. Well, just touch 100. That's extremely impressive. Thank you to Helen's Daughters for this opportunity to speak with you this week on climate change and its impacts on agriculture and food security. It's a subject that's very dear to my heart. Although I guess I'm recognized now for my work on climate and energy, but I actually started off in the agricultural sector. My training is in agriculture. My PhD is in agriculture. It's actually in crop physiology. And in a previous life, I used to be St. Lucia's permanent secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries. So anything that deals with agriculture and food security is extremely dear to my heart. And looking at the nexus between climate change and food security is something that I think is extremely important and probably something we do not pay sufficient attention to, which is unfortunate, and we'll get into that in a while. So I will be with you for 2 sessions this week. The first session tonight, what I will do is just take you through a discussion on climate change. What is climate change? What are the elements of climate change? To try to demystify some of the terms that you hear sometimes. And how is climate change impacting us generally? And then for you, more specifically, how is climate change impacting agriculture and food security, which are the things that are very dear to your heart. That's where you earn your livelihood. That's where you've devoted a lot of your life's work. In the Thursday session, having spoken about the issues and the challenges today, in the Thursday session, we will look at how do we adapt to the impacts of climate change on agriculture. So what are some of the things that you can do, that all of us can do to adjust and adapt to the impacts of climate change on agriculture, and really not just agriculture and food security, but also water security, because for us in the Caribbean, a lot of our agriculture is rain-fed. If we don't have rain, we don't have production, particularly for vegetable farmers. So, when we look at impacts on food security, we also have to look at impacts on water security. And if we're talking about adaptation, then we also have to talk about how do we adapt to the impacts of climate change on water security. So let's get into today's presentation, which hopefully you will find interesting. And we will take questions. I've left more than enough time at the end for us to take questions. So we will be able to, any things that you don't understand, just make a note of it or put it in the chat, and hopefully we'll have a full discussion afterwards. So climate change and the impacts of climate change on agriculture and food security. Let's start off, first of all, by a discussion of, what is climate, what is weather? Very often people mix up the two of them, and they use the two terms interchangeably. Weather refers to the short-term atmospheric conditions in a specific place at a specific time. So it tells you what is going on outside right now. So right now, wherever you are, if you're in Grenada, if you're in St. Kitts, if you're in St. Vincent, if you're in St. Lucia, wherever you are, the weather is what is happening right now. Is it cold? Is it hot? Is it wet? Is it dry? Is it raining? Is it cloudy? Is it clear? Weather gives you the instantaneous description of what the atmospheric conditions are in your country, or not even, or maybe even more localized in whatever part of the country you are. So weather would include information on atmospheric pressure, on rain, if you're living in a temperate climate, on snow, on hurricanes, on sunshine, on humidity, on temperature, and wind. That's what weather is. So when we speak of weather, we're speaking of what is happening right now, where you are operating, where you're living. When we speak of climate, however, what we're speaking about is the long-term observation of weather patterns. So the long-term patterns of temperature, precipitation, humidity, wind, and other atmospheric conditions in a region over a long time, usually 30 years or more. So climate refers to all of the observations that we've had about the weather patterns in a particular area over an extended period of time, over 30 years usually. So how has rainfall changed in this period? If you're living in Guave, if you're living in Deriso, if you're living in Windward, wherever you're living, those conditions over an extended period of time, 30 years or more, that's what climate is. So climate is the average weather conditions observed over a long time. Average for temperature, average for humidity, average for hurricane activity. That's what climate is. Weather is instantaneous, right here, right now. Climate is over an extended period of time, what's going on. So very often when we have a conversation about climate change and weather and all of these things, you hear about greenhouse gases. Now, greenhouse gases, or GHGs as they are abbreviated, whenever you're reading climate documents, and one of the things about climate change people, there are a lot of acronyms, and sometimes, your eyes can glaze over. And if you're speaking to someone who is not paying attention to what they're saying, they will just rattle off acronyms and believe that you're keeping track, and you can't, because there's just so many acronyms in there. And I've always said to the technocrats who have worked with me, assume that the person you're speaking to does not understand any of the acronyms. So please always break it down so people can understand, because there's nothing more frustrating than somebody talking to you about something and you don't have a clue what they're talking about because they're speaking in a language and they're using terms that you have no way of following. So when you see GHGs, they're referring to greenhouse gases. So greenhouse gases are gases in the atmosphere that have the ability to trap heat. It's like the cover of a greenhouse. Now, to this audience, I know this is something that you will understand very, very clearly, because very often when I speak to people, I tell them, okay, the greenhouse gases are like you going into a greenhouse in the middle of the day. If you go into a greenhouse in the middle of the day, as every single one of you knows, that greenhouse is hotter, it's warmer, the conditions in there are different to what they are outside, because that greenhouse has a covering. It could be plastic, it could be glass, but that covering is keeping conditions in a particular way inside the greenhouse. It is preventing heat from escaping out of the greenhouse and going out into the atmosphere. Well, that's what the greenhouse gases do. These greenhouse gases create a blanket over our planet, over the Earth. So while sunlight has the ability to pass through the blanket, which heats up the Earth, the gases do not allow the heat to escape. So sunlight comes in, it warms up the planet, but the heat can't escape because you have this blanket around. Now, if you one of the things you know about blankets is that the thicker the blanket, the warmer it is. So if you're sleeping in a bed, you say you're in the US or you're in the UK or anywhere in Europe during wintertime, and you cover yourself with a blanket, the thicker the blanket, the thicker the comforter, the warmer you feel. Well, it's the same thing with greenhouse gases. The more of these greenhouse gases that we emit, the thicker that layer across the planet gets, and the warmer our planet becomes. And when we're speaking about greenhouse gases, we're speaking really about three main greenhouse gases. There are more, but the ones we're primarily speaking about are carbon dioxide, methane or methane, depending on how you like to pronounce it, and nitrous oxide. So carbon dioxide you get when you burn fossil fuels. So to produce energy, we will burn diesel, we'll burn gasoline, could be in our cars, we will burn coal in some countries, we'll burn natural gas. One of the byproducts of burning fossil fuels to create energy, and it could be energy for electricity, or it could be energy to power your car, one of the byproducts of that is carbon dioxide. When you have material that is decomposing in a landfill, one of the byproducts of that is methane gas. Same thing with livestock production. Methane gas is one of the byproducts of livestock. And industrial processes, manufacturing and a lot of these big factories you have, they also increase the levels of greenhouse gases because they're burning fossil fuels, or in some instances, you're creating fertilizers or cement. All of these are generating greenhouse gases, and the more greenhouse gases you generate, the more greenhouse gases are emitted into the atmosphere, the thicker that blanket around our planet becomes. So what's the connection between that and global warming? We have global warming. Well, global warming refers to the steady increase in the average temperature of the Earth's surface, which is caused primarily by a buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now, it makes sense, right? As I said, the more of these greenhouse gases we put there, the thicker this blanket becomes, and the thicker the blanket becomes, the more of the heat that is generated on the planet. Wherever you are, that heat cannot escape, or not all of the heat can escape. Some does, but a lot of it does not escape. So it's radiated back onto the planet, and that is what is causing global warming. Our planet is getting warmer and warmer because it is trapping more and more of the heat. So that's like you have a greenhouse and you just keep on piling on more plastic on top of that greenhouse, more covering on top of that greenhouse. That greenhouse will get warmer and warmer, and whatever plants you're growing in there will be subjected to hotter temperatures. So the more greenhouse gases that are emitted, the warmer the planet becomes. So what are the impacts? What's the result of global warming? Well, as the average land and ocean temperatures of our planet increase over time, and remember, it's not just the land temperatures that are increasing. Our oceans are getting warmer because our planet is a combination of land, terrestrial, and water, marine, oceans. So as the planet gets warmer, it's not just the land that gets hotter. So those of us who are walking around these days, we recognize how hot it is. But if we were in the ocean, if we were sea animals, we will also appreciate that our oceans are getting warmer because our oceans are benefiting from a lot of that heat that is being radiated back, that's not being allowed to escape into the atmosphere. So as the average land and ocean temperatures of our planet increase over time, our climate system changes, leading to more frequent and severe heat waves, changing rainfall patterns. As it gets hotter and warmer, the atmosphere holds more moisture and you have changing rainfall patterns. The whole water cycle is disrupted with these hotter temperatures. Ice is melting at the North and the South Pole. So you have at the North Pole, the Arctic, and at the South Pole, the Antarctic. What is happening is that as the planet is getting warmer, the ice there, the glaciers there are melting because the temperatures are just so warm. When you check some of the temperatures they say that they're experiencing in Greenland or in Antarctica, you would think that maybe you're somewhere on a subtropical location, because these temperatures are actually getting quite warm these days. In fact, what we're noticing is that the temperatures on the North Pole and the South Pole are warming 4 times in the case of the North Pole and 3 times in the case of the South Pole faster than the average temperature for the rest of the planet. So when we speak of global warming, we have to understand that not all parts of the planet are warming at the same rate, And ominously for us, because that's where the two poles are, the North Pole, that's where the ice caps are in the North Pole and the South Pole, those areas are warming faster. And as those areas are warming faster, the ice is melting and sea levels are starting to rise, which has devastating consequences for island countries like ours, where all of us live very near the ocean. In some instances, our countries are flat, so it will not take much sea level rise to now start causing serious problems for us, our livelihoods, where we live, and all of these things. So that is the result of global warming, a whole shift in our climate system. And one way I like to explain it to people is, think of you running a temperature. You have a fever. The longer that fever stays, the worse it gets for you. So if you have a fever, you have an infection or something, you have a cold and you have a fever, your temperature goes up to maybe 99 degrees, 100 degrees Fahrenheit for a day, then that's not too alarming, because your body will bounce back. You expect that to happen. If you've been running a fever for 2 or 3 days, then that's very serious. And in fact, you will notice in a lot of the medication, they'll tell you, if you're running a temperature for too long, seek medical attention, because it means your body's organs are now being impacted by these temperatures that you're running. Your organs were not meant to be running with a temperature of 101, 102. That's not normal for it. And as that extends, then you run the risk of organ problems with your kidney, your liver, your heart. You don't want that to happen, and that's why doctors are very keen to ensure that they can cause that fever to break very quickly. What do you think is happening with our planet? Our planet is running a fever. The temperatures that we're seeing now are temperatures that many of our ecosystems on land and our ecosystems in the water, are not used to. So that is causing problems, because these temperatures are just steadily increasing, and the animals that live in there, the plant species that live in there, have to be constantly adapting to warmer and warmer temperatures. So that is causing serious problems for our terrestrial, our land ecosystems, and our marine, our ocean ecosystems. So climate change, when we speak about climate change is a long-term change in the average weather patterns that have come to define Earth's local, regional, and global climates. So remember, we said the climate is what we measure over an extended period of time, 30 years or more. So as we see these things are changing, we realize, oh, hold on, but the amount of rainfall we were getting before is not what we're getting now. The temperatures, the average temperatures now are much warmer than they were 30 years ago. So something is happening. Our hurricanes are getting stronger. Something is happening. We have more frequent droughts. Something seems to be happening there. Our oceans seem to be getting hotter, and coral reefs are dying. So that is climate change. It's a long-term change in the average weather patterns that have come to define Earth's local, regional, and global climates. And since the 1800s, human activities have been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. So the people who claim to not believe in climate change will tell you, but these things have always happened. You've always had the temperatures of the planet changing. You're making it look as if this is a new thing. Over the history of our planet, we've always had these changes. It is, yes, there has always been variability in our planet, but that variability is due to natural variability. We've never had variability caused by what man is doing to the planet through particularly industrial processes and burning fossil fuels to create energy, because we need more energy to create more, to produce more iPhones, to produce more devices, to build more cars, because we want more cars, we want more everything. Consumption and production is driving it. So the more consumption and production we have, the more industrial activity we have, the more fossil fuels we need to burn, and the more greenhouse gases we're producing. So it is very clear that what is driving the climate change that we're seeing right now is not the natural variability of our planet, but it is man-made. These are activities that we, humankind, are causing because of our way of life right now. Now, there's some terms that you will hear whenever you hear a conversation about climate change. One of them is mitigation. Mitigation is one of the terms you very often hear about. And mitigation refers to how do we reduce the flow of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere? So to mitigate climate change means that we are trying to reduce the flow of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, that are causing that warming to take place. How do we cause that to reverse? How do we reduce that? That is what mitigation is involved with. So mitigation involves cutting greenhouse gases from main sources such as power plants, factories, cars, and livestock farms. Okay, so when we talk about mitigation, we're talking about how we reducing on emissions of greenhouse gases. But we also have natural processes that absorb carbon dioxide. Again, you're farmers, so you know that carbon dioxide is absorbed by plants and combined with the energy from sunlight to create carbohydrates. That's what photosynthesis is all about. So any plant material, any green photosynthetic material or forests, they absorb carbon dioxide as part of their life processes. So the more plant material we have, the more we are able to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, because we have what are called sinks. Plants and forests are sinks for carbon dioxide. They absorb carbon dioxide. But another sink for carbon dioxide that very many people do not know about are our oceans. Oceans also absorb carbon dioxide. The more carbon dioxide we put out into the atmosphere is the more carbon dioxide our oceans absorb. And that causes a problem that I'll speak about a little bit later on, how it changes the chemistry of our oceans. But our oceans are sinks for carbon dioxide. They absorb carbon dioxide. And soil is also a very important sink for carbon dioxide. Forests, oceans, and soil, they absorb and they store greenhouse gases, and they are an important part of the mitigation solution. So when we're talking about mitigation, we're talking about two things. We're talking about cutting back on greenhouse gases, so maybe shifting to solar power so that we're not burning fossil fuels to create energy, or we are not rearing livestock. We're moving more to a plant-based diet, because the more livestock you have to rear, the more methane gas you're producing. So that's how we cut greenhouse gases, and we prevent those greenhouse gases from getting out into the atmosphere. But another way to mitigate is to absorb what is already there, is to increase the capacity of the sinks to absorb what is already there. And we do that, as I said, with forestation, planting more trees, wherever there's deforestation, engaging in reforestation. That is how we mitigate with nature-based solutions. Reducing emissions requires us to change everything we do, from how we power our economy and grow our food, to how we travel and live, and the products we consume. So if we want to reduce emissions, we have to change our lifestyle. It isn't every time a new iPhone comes out, so you have the iPhone 11 and then the iPhone 12 and the iPhone 13 and the iPhone 14. Not you, but your children will probably want it. That is driving production. That is driving industrial processes. You are not composting. You're not returning organic matter back to the soil. That is driving greenhouse gas production. A very controversial one, because not everybody likes to be told what to eat. But if you eat a diet that is primarily animal-based, then unfortunately you are also driving greenhouse gas production, because more livestock has to be reared for you, because you are eating a very high protein diet, but protein from animal protein, and those animals are generating methane gas. Now, I'm not telling you that you should all now go and become vegetarians or vegans. I'm just stating the fact that the more animal products you eat, the more methane gas is being produced as a result of your diet. So how we power our economy, how we grow our food, how we travel and live, and the products we consume, all of these things impact on mitigation. What are some of the things that we can do to improve mitigation, to improve the removal of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide from our atmosphere? Well, we can plant trees, and we can increase the size of our forests and stop deforestation. That's an obvious one. We can shift from using fossil fuels to using renewable energy to generate electricity. So when our power plant, be it Grenlec or Skenlec in St. Kitts, or Lucelec in St. Lucia, or Vinlec in St. Vincent, or Domlec in Dominica, if they are if they move their generation from diesel to now start using renewable sources. So in the case of Dominica, there's a lot of hydro that is being used to power Dominic. But if we can now start using wind and start using geothermal and start using solar, then it means we're not burning fossil fuels to generate electricity. So that is a mitigation action, because if we're not burning fossil fuels, then we're not putting out carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Taking public transportation, walking, cycling, and carpooling. You are reducing on the carbon footprint of your transportation system. So you're not driving a vehicle, your own vehicle, with only you in it to go everywhere, but you're taking public transportation. So the one minibus is now transporting 10 people, as opposed to 10 people in 10 cars driving up and down the street. So taking public transportation, walking, cycling, which does not generate any greenhouse gases at all, or carpooling. So if 2 or 3 of you are going somewhere, then you all go in one car as opposed to everybody going in their own car. Those are mitigation actions. Using energy efficient lights and appliances. If you can reduce the amount of electricity that your appliances use up, the amount of electricity that your lights use up, then that is a mitigation action. Or purchasing electric or hybrid vehicles. I just came from an activity. In fact, I was the guest speaker today at an activity hosted by the Department of Sustainable Development in St. Lucia, where they are now kickstarting an electric mobility program, where they're trying to encourage people to purchase hybrid vehicles and purchase electric vehicles. That is all part of St. Lucia's commitment to reducing its carbon footprint. If you are using an electric vehicle, that electric vehicle will reduce on your carbon footprint, will reduce on the emissions of greenhouse gases, even if the electricity that you're using to power that vehicle, to charge it up, is electricity on a grid that is generated by diesel. Why? Because your electric vehicle is so much more efficient in converting electricity to power than your ordinary internal combustion engine vehicle, your vehicle that is run by diesel or by gasoline. Your diesel or gasoline powered vehicle is only 30% efficient in converting that fossil fuel to power to move you, whilst the electric vehicle, from the figures I've seen, convert over 80% of the electricity to power. So even if you are using electricity to power your vehicle, and that electricity is from a grid that is powered by the same fossil fuels, the same diesel and well, it's not so much gasoline, but diesel, that vehicle that you're driving is a lot more efficient and is using up less fossil fuels. And of course, with hybrid vehicles, they use a combination of electricity and fuel to reduce on the carbon footprint, but they're not entirely electric. So the gasoline powered engine charges the battery, and you run on the battery for an extended period of time, and then as the battery power diminishes, or you want to drive faster, then the fossil fuel, the gas powered engine comes in. But if you're driving, you're in the city, you're driving in conditions where you're not going above 30 miles an hour, then you're basically using your battery to power you, and that is a mitigation action. So the other term that you have very much in climate change circles is adaptation. What is adaptation? Adaptation refers to the changes that we make in our lives, our communities, our economies, and our environment to help us cope with the effects or impacts of climate change. So that's us saying, okay, mitigation can only go so far. We will only take out so much carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide or methane from the atmosphere. But there are impacts that we will see. So we will see sea level rise. We will see hotter temperatures. We will see droughts. We will experience droughts. We'll experience flooding. How do we adapt to that? What changes can we make in our lives to help us cope with the effects or impacts of climate change? What are some of the things that we can do so that when these impacts come around, when we experience them, we are not as vulnerable and they do not impact us as severely as if we did nothing? So adaptation helps to reduce losses from the present and future impacts of climate change, because we know what's happening now, but then we can also see what's happening. We can also see that the droughts are becoming more frequent. We can see that the hurricanes are getting stronger, not more frequent. So climate change doesn't cause hurricanes to become more frequent. So it's not like, okay, we Before we had these impacts of climate change, we used to have an average of 10 hurricanes per season. Now, because of climate change, it's 15, it's 20. No, climate change is not working that way. What climate change is doing, because our oceans are warmer, the hurricanes are stronger because the hurricanes feed off the energy, that heat that is in our oceans. That's why you had Beryl forming so early this year. The earliest formed Category 4, Category 5 hurricane in the history of the Atlantic hurricane season, because our oceans were already so warm already in May. So what happens as the oceans become so warm, then the hurricanes get stronger because there's more energy in there for them to feed off. So that's why we say climate change increases the severity of hurricanes, but not the frequency of hurricanes. So adaptation refers to how do you adapt to that? How do you adapt to the fact that hurricanes will now get stronger? The hurricanes will now get more severe. The winds will be stronger. The amount of rainfall they will drop on the country will be strong, will be heavier. How do we adapt to that? That's what adaptation is about. And what are some of the actions of adaptation? Well, the first one is for you. You can grow crops that can handle hotter temperatures, longer droughts, and changes in rainfall patterns. So if there are particular varieties of a crop that you're growing, and that variety is more drought tolerant, that variety can deal with greater variability in rainfall, or that variety can handle hotter temperatures. So you shift to using that variety, then that is an adaptation action on your part. That is you adapting to the fact that the conditions under which you farm have changed and are changing. So you are now growing crops that can better handle those new climatic conditions. Planting trees that prevent soil erosion. That's another way of an adaptation, because what you have with heavy rainfall is you have land slippage. You have land slippage because your soil is loose. So when you plant trees that bind that soil together, then that is an adaptation action, because it means it could be vetiver that you've planted, or it could be mangoes that you've planted along a riverbank. The roots are now binding the soil together. So you're preventing soil erosion, you're preventing land slippage, you're preventing that very valuable material for you, which is soil, which is the medium in which you grow your crops. You're preventing that from getting lost. That is an adaptation action. You're restoring mangroves. If you restore mangrove that had been damaged, that is an adaptation action. Why? Because first of all, mangroves are big sinks for carbon dioxide. Mangroves absorb a lot of carbon dioxide themselves, but mangroves also form a very important buffer, a filter. So if you have storm surge, so you have heavy winds and a hurricane passing through, and you have strong storm surge hitting the island, the mangroves almost act as a storm break, a wave break. So they prevent that strong wave action from getting onto the shore, because they break the action of the waves. But the other thing that they do is that they filter some of that soil, that silt that is being lost because of soil erosion, because of landslides. They filter it within the very intricate root system of the mangroves, and they prevent it from getting out into your ocean, where that can cause problems with your marine ecosystem, with coral reefs, etc. So the more you restore your mangroves, is the better adapted you become to the impacts of climate change. Building stronger houses, bridges, and infrastructure, to withstand, so bridges and roads, to withstand bigger culverts, to withstand stronger hurricanes and more frequent floods. That is an adaptation action. Conserving water by harvesting rainwater and improving water storage. You know that, okay, you're experiencing droughts more often. If you are experiencing droughts more often, but you're not doing anything about it, then that doesn't make sense. But if you know you are experiencing droughts more often, and particularly you're a farmer, and you need that water for you to irrigate your lettuce, for you to irrigate your tomatoes, for you to irrigate your tree crops, then how you adapt to that is by conserving water. So maybe in the past you only had one 400-gallon water tank. What you may want to do now is to invest in some more 400-gallon water tanks, or maybe even some bigger water tanks, some 1,000-gallon water tanks, so that you can store as much water, both municipal water, from your, be it Wasco or Dowasco or whoever it is that supplies you with water, or even better, you're harvesting rainwater. So you're harvesting rainwater off your roof and you're storing it so that when you need that water, you have access to it. That's an adaptation action. Installing early warning systems so that you can protect your lives, you could protect your livelihood. Those of you who have livestock, you have cows. So if there's an early warning system that lets you know that there's a system that will be coming through, it will drop heavy rainfall in a particular area, then you could retrieve your animals beforehand, and you don't have to be doing the daredevil thing that you see some people trying to do in the middle of a storm, which is going and trying to take their cows out because they realize that there's a very strong possibility that the cow will drown where the cow is because the water levels are rising so quickly. Early warning systems will tell you what are the conditions that are expected and how these conditions will probably worsen. So what can you do to protect yourself, your family, and your livelihood? Improving public health service to deal with heat waves and diseases spread by pests. I'm sure you are experiencing just how difficult it is to work outside these days as a farmer. Many people are now experiencing heat stroke. People who are not hydrating themselves sufficiently will end up with kidney problems. So you have to ensure that your public health services, both in terms of information, education, public awareness, but also being able to respond quickly enough that your public health services are working well. Minimizing food waste. The less food you waste is the less your carbon footprint, because it means that you're not engaging in wastage. Any type of wastage increases your carbon footprint because it means that you've had to use, could be fertilizers, could be whatever, to produce that food, which is then going to waste. So you're now using up carbon footprint for no reason. So if you minimize food waste, and even better, if you now compost and you take that food waste and you put it back into the soil to improve the organic composition of your soil, then that's even better. And building defenses to protect against sea level rise and storm surges, that's another example of an adaptation action. And the final phrase that you hear very often, particularly in small island developing states like ours, is loss and damage. And that is a phrase that is not very well understood. And when you speak about loss and damage, we're referring to the negative impacts of climate change that are beyond what people and communities can cope with or adapt to. So loss and damage is anything that is beyond adaptation. So sea level rise. If you have sea level rise that is now where your beach used to be before, you have no more beach anymore. That is now water. That is now underwater because you have sea level rise. You can't adapt to that. If your oceans have become warmer and you've lost your coral reefs are now dying, you can't adapt to that. There's nothing you could do to adapt to that. So the things that are beyond adaptation, you hit, like this is Dominique after the passage of Hurricane Maria. You have extreme weather events that are hitting your country. You cannot adapt to that. So that is when we refer to loss and damage. Those are the negative impacts of climate change that are beyond. I think there's a microphone that's open. So unfortunately, we're hearing some feedback coming in. So can you please mute your microphones? Right. Loss and damage refers to the negative impacts of climate change that are beyond what people and communities can cope with or adapt to. And examples of loss and damage are, unfortunately, disappearance of an island or community due to sea level rise. There are islands in the Pacific right now, like Kiribati, like the Marshall Islands, like Fiji, that are disappearing or will disappear if we continue to see the kind of sea level rise that we're experiencing right now. There are islands in the Bahamas that will probably disappear because of sea level rise. Flat islands. So if you live on an island that is mountainous, yes, okay, you'll be able to retreat inland. But imagine you're living on an island like Marshall Islands or Kiribati, where the tallest point on that island is 5 to 6 feet above sea level. That's the tallest point. That's the highest point on that island. If you're talking sea level rise of 1 meter or 2 meters, then you are talking about the very real possibility of that island disappearing. That's an example of loss and damage. A plant or an animal species going extinct due to changes in its ecosystem, the ecosystem in which it lives. So it could be changes in temperature, changes in rainfall. That is loss and damage. You can't adapt to that. Loss of human lives due to a climate-related disaster, such as a hurricane. That actually is what we refer to as a non-economic loss. You can't put a value to that. I can put a value to buildings being damaged, bridges being washed away, roads being washed away. When you do your damage and loss assessment, you can put a cost to that. If crops have been lost, you could say, okay, I had 5 acres of bananas. The production from that would have been X. That is the loss that has been experienced as a result of the passage of this hurricane or the flooding or the strong winds. If you have loss of human lives, you can't put a value to it. That's a non-economic loss that you cannot quantify. If you have people have had to migrate due to land loss, so they've had to leave their home. So, for example, in Dominica, when Tropical Storm Erica hit, and it hit the community of Petit Savan it was very devastating there. And the government made a decision that people should no longer live in Petit Savan, that they should live somewhere else. The loss of that history, whatever cultural heritage, whatever was associated with that community of Petit Savan, that is a loss. That's a cultural loss that you cannot put a value to. So these are some of the things that we refer to as non-economic losses. Loss of heritage, that's another non-economic loss. Loss of cultural identity, because you no longer are in a community where you grew up, where your parents and your grandparents grew up. Yes, you might be living in a nice house that the government has provided for you, but that does not compare to what you used to live in and the memories and the stories that you had in the community where you lived and you've now had to abandon because it is no longer habitable because of climate change. Loss of buildings is an example of loss and damage. But loss of biodiversity, loss of territory is a non-economic loss. Migration due to land loss. Some people, I spoke about Kiribati and the Marshall Islands. The people who live in those areas will probably have to find other countries for them to live in. Fiji has actually been looking to see where it can buy land in another country with the understanding that it may have to move its people out from Fiji to some other country because Fiji will no longer be inhabitable because of rising sea levels. Migration due to land loss, that's loss and damage. Our oceans becoming more acidic because they're being forced to absorb more carbon dioxide. Earlier, I told you that as our oceans absorb more carbon dioxide, it changes the chemistry. The reason it changes the chemistry is because carbon dioxide, CO2, mixes with H2O, the water in the oceans, forms H2CO3, carbonic acid, and that now causes the oceans to become more acidic. So when you look at the pH of our oceans are becoming more acidic because they're being forced to absorb more carbon dioxide. As the oceans are becoming more acidic, some things are happening. Coral reefs are dying out because the acidity of the ocean is a little bit, and it doesn't have to be much. So we're not talking about an ocean becoming very acidic. So if you step in it, then you start seeing your skin peeling. No, it's a small change. But that small change is significant enough to completely change the whole ecosystem and cause the plant and the animal species that live there to not be able to live the same way. So shellfish, things like lobsters and shrimp and conch, they will not be able to form the hard shell that they need to form to protect themselves from predators in the ocean, because that hard shell cannot form as easily when the ocean is more acidic. So you're disrupting a whole ecosystem, but you're also disrupting people's nutrition. Because if you are like me, for example, I don't eat meat, I eat fish and seafood, and that fish and seafood now will become less plentiful because it's not available because of ocean acidification. Then you have a problem. I see a hand raised, but is it a question or can it wait until we've gone through everything? Is it something that's not clear? Because we did say we take questions at the end. So if you could keep your question to the end, then Kia Johnson will deal with that question at the end, unless it's something that you've missed out and you need me to clarify. Yeah, okay. Damage to an ecosystem is another example of loss and damage. And loss of livelihoods, you've lost your livelihood completely. That's an example of loss and damage. And finally, before we get into more specifically the impacts of climate change on food security and agriculture, I wanted to take you through all of these terms so you understood when we speak about mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, what we're talking about. There's the UNFCCC that you hear people talking about, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That is really the fundamental agreement that countries around the world signed in 1992 that determines how do we take action to prevent climate change. 194 countries all around the world agreed and signed on to this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and that is what has guided our climate change actions every year. So every year there's this conference of the parties that takes place in another country, in a different country every year. Last year it was in Dubai. This year it will be in Azerbaijan. Next year it will be in Brazil. The year after, I think Australia is bidding for it. Every year it goes to a different country. It goes to countries that have the capacity to host it, because you're really talking about a minimum of 40,000 people attending these conferences to look at how much progress has been made and what else we should be doing. So the Bible that is used to base all of the actions that are taken within climate change negotiations is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But in 2015, we had another agreement, the Paris Agreement, and that was agreed to at the 21st Conference of the Parties in Paris, a place called Le Bourget. 196 countries in Paris, France adopted it, and its goal is to hold the increase in the global temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to limit the temperature increase, to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That is very important, because what this is saying is that 2 degrees Celsius is the absolute maximum that we should allow the global warming to get to. But for small island developing states, it's even less than 2 degrees Celsius. It is lower, it is 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we have to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, because anything above that will have catastrophic impacts for small island developing states. So that is what the Paris Agreement is looking to do. And one thing about climate change is that climate change is based on science. It's not, boy, I think, that river used to be flowing stronger before, and it's not flowing that strong anymore. Or gas, boy, I really feel hot these days. It's much hotter. To me, I just feel it's much hotter than it was before. Or we have droughts occurring more frequently. No, that's not how climate change works. Climate change works on science. You have to be able to back up what you're saying with the science. And that is what makes it very difficult for the people who say they do not believe in climate change to debate against people who see the impacts of climate change, because the impacts of climate change are based on science. So if you're coming to me and telling me that there is no climate change, then you need to produce evidence, scientific evidence, that there is no climate change. And that's where they fall apart. When you ask them to produce the scientific evidence to counter the evidence that you have, the scientific evidence that you have, they can't fall apart. They can't do it. So in addition to reducing the amount of greenhouse gases that are produced by countries committed to providing support to developing countries to undertake mitigation and adaptation activities. The Paris Agreement it provides a framework for financial, technical, and capacity building support to those countries who need it. And we've heard about sustainable development. It's development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's based on 3 pillars: economic, social, and environmental. We've heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 goals that countries around the world adopted in 2015, the same year that we adopted the Paris Agreement. So there are very close synergies between the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. Because when you look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, you see there that there are things like goal number 7, which speaks to affordable and clean energy. That means moving away from using fossil fuels, diesel, natural gas, coal, and using renewable energy. If you do that, then you are mitigating, you are lessening the impacts of climate change, because you're removing greenhouse gases. Sustainable Development Goal number 13 speaks specifically to taking climate action. Sustainable Development Goal number 14 speaks to life below water. So how do we deal with our marine ecosystem and the things that happen there? Sustainable Development Goal number 15 looks at life on land. So again, there are many Sustainable Development Goals that their targets relate very specifically to climate change, or a cross-cutting where climate change is concerned. So to just take you very quickly through how climate change is impacting what you are most interested in, which is food and water security and agriculture. Human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. That is a finding from the scientific documents that are produced by a body called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Every 7 years, they put out a set of reports that really looks at all of the science around climate change, puts it in a format that people can understand, and these reports tell you what is going on with our planet. And the last set of reports they put out, assessment report number 6, showed that the human influence, us, we, human beings, have warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. So for the last 2,000 years, we've not seen this level of warming. Carbon emissions from fossil fuels reached a record high in 2023. So it's continuing to go up. So we are continuing to emit more and more greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. So we are not at the point where we've peaked and we're going down. We are still going up. And that has very serious consequences for us. And when we look at the countries that are producing those greenhouse gases, we see that there are countries like China, India, and that's more recent. So because these countries are now growing economies, emerging economies, they have now become major emitters, China in particular. But historically, it was the United States, it was Russia, it was Japan, it was the European Union. Those were the countries that were the major emitters of greenhouse gases. So that shows you over a period from 1990 to 2030, it shows you. So you could see China, which is in purple there, you could see that in 1990, China was not that big an emitter of greenhouse gases. But look at China now, where China is projected to be by 2030. China is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet. You've seen that the United States, the last one there, the bottom, the blue, you could see that its greenhouse gas emissions have been steadily declining. You could see the Europe, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD countries. You could see that so that's like Germany, France, Italy, the United Kingdom. You could see that their share of greenhouse gases has been steadily decreasing. And when you want to know who the culprits are, well, the top 20 companies have contributed to 480 billion tons of carbon dioxide, and that's countries, that's Saudi Aramco, that's Chevron, that's ExxonMobil, the big oil companies. They're the ones that are causing the problem. So I'm sure somebody wants to know, well, the Caribbean, how is the Caribbean contributing to greenhouse gases? How much are we producing? Well, there's the answer. Antigua and Barbuda, 0.002%. Grenada, 0.004%. St. Kitts and Nevis, 0.001%. St. Lucia, 0.002%. Even Trinidad and Tobago, which is the biggest oil and gas producer in our region, Trinidad and Tobago is producing less than 0.2%, less than 1/5 of 1% of greenhouse gas emissions. Guyana, that figure is a little old. Guyana is now, that number is going up from 0.015 because Guyana is now an oil and gas producer. There's a lot of oil and gas exploration taking place in Guyana. But that figure at the bottom is what you have to look at. Less than 0.2% of global greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the Caribbean. Yet, the Caribbean countries are among the countries that are most impacted by climate change. So we are impacted and we're feeling the effects. We're losing our livelihoods. In some instances, we're losing our lives as a result of a problem that not only did we not contribute to, but we continue to not contribute to. Land and sea surface temperatures are hotter than ever before. And, you know, you go into the ocean now, you'll feel it. You walk anywhere in any one of our countries, in any Caribbean island, you will feel it. Land and sea surface temperatures are hotter than ever before. The impact of sea level rise is being underestimated. And again, that's not surprising. It is very difficult to stay behind a computer and try and predict how the planet is going to react. The planet is a living system. And as one thing happens, it now impacts something else. So you have all types of feedback loops taking place. You all kind of tipping points. So you get to a point where things just start to cascade. They start to get worse. That's what we're seeing now. That you're seeing, I saw a report, for example, 2 years ago that said the ice in Greenland is melting at the level that scientists thought would be a worst-case scenario by the year 2070. So 2 to 3 years ago, we had gotten to what scientists believe would have been a worst-case scenario 50 years from now for ice melting. And that's because we just cannot predict what's going on. And in most instances, we are underestimating what is going on. The ocean is getting more acidic. what that actually means, and I explain, I explain that to you as the ocean is being forced to absorb more carbon dioxide. And these are all headlines that are taken off scientific journals or newspapers or articles. So these are all things that that if you go over the last 2 to 3 years, you will see that these are regular headlines that you will see on any of the international papers. Hurricane Otis teaches a terrifying lesson in rapid hurricane intensification. Otis went from a tropical storm in October last year to a Category 5 hurricane in less than 15 hours. So imagine you're told that there's a weather system approaching and it's sitting outside your island. Impact is expected in the next 12 to 24 hours. But right now it's a tropical storm. So you're preparing for winds of around 50 to 60 miles an hour. By the time it hits your island, it hits your country as a Category 5 hurricane, packing winds of well over 155 miles an hour. That is what is happening now because our oceans are just so warm. And that is, unfortunately, what we predicted would have started happening. And we saw it this year again. Hurricane Beryl broke all sorts of records. Earliest Category 4 and Category 5 hurricane on record. The hurricane that has been recorded furthest east in the Atlantic since 1933. The strongest sustained winds prior to August. Why? Because those ocean temperatures were just so hot. The oceans were just so warm. There was so much energy for the ocean, for the hurricane to pick up on. Last year, July was the hottest month ever recorded. July 2023 was the hottest month ever recorded. Not just the hottest July, the hottest month ever recorded. Well, guess what happened this July? This July then became the hottest month. Not just the hottest July, but the hottest month ever recorded. So that record didn't last 1 year. And if you look at what has been happening to temperatures, you will see that, and the next slide shows it even more clearly, the temperatures have just been increasing at an alarming rate. Last year, 2023, was the hottest year on record by a long shot. And that you'll see. So you see there that while there has been a steady increase, so the last 10 years have been the hottest 10 years since we started recording temperatures in 1880. But look at the difference between 2023 and everywhere else. The hottest year before 2023 was 2016. 2023 is head and shoulders above every other year. And that, again, is an ominous sign. And if you look at what has been happening to global temperatures between 1880 and 2021, this video shows it very clearly. The yellow and orange parts are where the temperature is getting warmer. So anywhere you see orange and yellow, you could see. So we now in the 1980s, the mid-1980s, you see what is happening. You see how the entire planet is turning yellow and orange. And as we get to 2021, you see this. And that's not even counting 2023 when it got hottest ever. In August, we broke a streak of 13 consecutive months of heat records. So from June 2023 to June 2024, well, to July 2024, every single one of those months broke the monthly record for heat on the planet. And the temperatures that we've seen this year are suggesting that 2024 will break the record that was set in 2023 for the hottest year ever. So for climate vulnerable countries like ours, and this is a community on the east coast of St. Lucia, this is Denry. For climate vulnerable countries like ours, the climate crisis will have devastating consequences. The impacts are diverse and grave. Sea level rise, more frequent flooding, longer and more frequent droughts, stronger hurricanes, water insecurity, food insecurity, and adverse health impacts. And if we look at where we are likely to be by 2100, and again, as I said, this is all scientific based, so they track these things. Right now, we have warmed to 1.3 degrees Celsius. In 2023, warming had reached 1.3. Now remember, I said that the goal of the Paris Agreement was to ensure that we did not get past 1.5 degrees Celsius. We right now are at 1.3 degrees Celsius. And if we are to look at the different scenarios, so if you look at what is happening right now in the world, not what I say I will do, but what I am doing. So not what the countries promise to do, but what they are doing based on their current policies and actions. We will get close to 2.7 degrees Celsius warming by the end of this century. It will be anywhere between 2.2 and 3.4. So a healthy average or an unhealthy average is 2.7 degrees Celsius. If we have to look at another scenario, what they promise they will do based on the targets that they set for 2030, then we'll be slightly better off. We will probably land between 2 degrees Celsius and 3 degrees Celsius, somewhere around 2.5 degrees Celsius. If we have to look at the pledges and the targets, so the things that they say, yeah, we'll do that, and these are the pledges that we've made, and blah, 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 then we'll probably end somewhere around 2.1 degrees Celsius. So that's between 1.7 and 2.6. The most optimistic scenario, that's if everybody does everything that they say they will do, and even more than what they plan to do, and what we think that they're capable of doing. The most optimistic scenario has us between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2.3 degrees Celsius. So somewhere around 1.8. So clearly, it will be very difficult for us to keep the global temperature, the increasing global temperature, to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Right now, we're hovering, if best case scenario, we're hovering around 1.8 degrees Celsius. Keeping the global average temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius will be essential to limiting future loss and damage. And this is coming out of the sixth assessment report, and it was repeated at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. But the line that you have to be worried about is that last bit there that I've put in bold. The gravity, scope, and frequency of loss and damage will continue to increase with every additional fraction of a degree of temperature increase. So, don't let people fool you and say, well, you don't get to 1.5, but it's 1.6, 1.7. It's not that bad. Yes, it is that bad. Every additional fraction of a degree of temperature increase. Remember that analogy I gave you with a human being, a body keeping a temperature and running a fever for too long. As those temperatures stay in that danger zone, then you will see some very serious impacts. And the World Resources Institute has looked at some of these impacts of what you'll get 1.5, 2, 2.5 on food security. 1.5, best case scenario for us, we'll see a 6% decline in average global, average maize crop yield at 1.5. At 2 degrees Celsius, we'll see a 7 to 10% loss of rangeland livestock across the globe. At 3 degrees Celsius, we will see over 400 million people exposed and vulnerable to crop yield losses. Over 400 million people at 3 degrees Celsius. And remember, that's where we're headed right now at 2.73 degrees Celsius. Let's look at the natural environment. At 1.5 degrees Celsius, we'll see extensive coral reef decline by between 70 and 90%. At 2 degrees Celsius, we'll see declines due to a reduction of geographic range by more than a half, 18% insects, 16% plants, 8% vertebrates. We will see that is basically talking about species extinction there, decline in the range of those animals. Rainforests die back at 3 degrees Celsius, permafrost collapse. Water at 1.5 degrees Celsius, 271 million people across the world exposed to water insecurity. That's at 1.5 degrees Celsius, sorry. At 2 degrees Celsius, a 36% increase in the frequency of rainfall extremes over land. And at 3 degrees Celsius, 10 months average length of drought, up from 2 months at 1.5. So right now, at 1.5, we're probably looking at 2 months of drought. If we get to 3 degrees Celsius, we're talking about 10 months average length of drought in some instances. That's almost the entire year some countries will spend in drought. So that shows you how these impacts just with every fraction of a degree. And Professor Michael Taylor has looked at some of these and the impact of a 2.5 degrees Celsius warming on the Caribbean, reduction of between 15 and 25% in precipitation, with an intensification of drying in the Southern Caribbean, over 200 days excessively warm, up to 6 fewer intense rainfall days, hot and dry days, increases of over 20 days for most of the Caribbean, temperatures warmer by between 1.5 and 3 degrees Celsius across the Caribbean, and moderate to severe drought approximately 34% of the time. So Professor Taylor and his group at MONA are saying to us that if we get to 2.5 degrees Celsius, we will be in drought conditions in the Caribbean for roughly 1/3 of the year. Approximately 34% of the time, so roughly 4 months of the year, every year, we'll be in moderate to severe drought conditions. That's not something to look forward to. More than 230 medical journals in the middle of the COVID pandemic identified climate change as the greatest threat to global public health. So what are the impacts on agriculture and food security? Well, I think by now you're able to figure them out. More frequent droughts. If there are more frequent droughts, that is a serious problem for you as a farmer because you do not have the water to irrigate your plants. You cannot grow any plants if you do not have water. But also, as you do not have water, then your whole soil ecosystem changes. So more frequent droughts are devastating for agriculture and food security. But equally devastating is extreme flooding, which you will get more of with climate change, because flooding will drown out your crops, particularly vegetable farmers. Flooding will create conditions where you have anaerobic conditions in your soil. So that is not good for you and will wash away important infrastructure, because it's not just passive flooding. Flooding is coming with water that's raging down. So you have irrigation infrastructure. You have other things that you've put in place. That flooding will wash that away. So you will have damage to agriculture infrastructure, in addition to damage to your crops, and also the possibility of damage and death to your livestock that you have grazing in low-lying areas. Hotter temperatures. It is becoming unhealthy for a farmer or a farm worker to work in these temperatures right now. And I do not think that is something that people are paying sufficient attention to. You cannot stay out in these temperatures, out in the sun, exposed for extended periods of time. And if you are, then you have to make sure that you're very well hydrated, because you could end up with very serious kidney problems. So very problematic for your crops, because many of your cultivars, many of your varieties are not meant to grow in those conditions, so your yield will be significantly reduced. But also for your livestock, I mean, you have to ensure that your livestock is very well hydrated. Your cows, your small ruminants, that they're very well hydrated when they're out in the pasture in these temperatures. But you also have to look after yourself and your farm workers and ensure that you are not being overexposed in those hotter temperatures. Stronger hurricanes are devastating to agriculture infrastructure, devastating to crops. For those of us who had banana industries on which our economies were based, stronger hurricanes and strong winds were devastating to that pseudo stem, that banana pseudo stem. So you have stronger hurricanes, you now have to worry about the impact on agriculture, but you also have to worry about the impact on a lot of your infrastructure. And, we've seen the damage of strong hurricanes across the Caribbean. When Hurricane Ivan hit Grenada in 2004, it caused damage that was equivalent to over 200% of that country's GDP. When Dominica had the twin strikes of Erica in 2015 and then Maria in 2017, Erica caused damage of equivalent to 90% of Dominica's GDP, and Maria caused damage equivalent to 226% of Dominica's GDP. So can you imagine? In the space of 24 hours, Dominica suffered losses that were equivalent to 2 years of productive output by that country. And Hurricane Irma in the BVI, over 300%. That damage was equivalent, the cost of that damage was equivalent to 300% of that country's GDP. So you could go from being reasonably well off and making some progress to the next day finding that your country is a mess and that you now have to start this process of recovery again. Sea level rise is very problematic for a couple of reasons. First of all, for countries that depend on groundwater, so aquifers and wells, as your sea levels are starting to increase, you have that sea level, that salt water encroaching and contaminating your groundwater sources. So what used to be fresh water before is now becoming brackish water, and you cannot use it for drinking purposes. But the other thing that sea level rise is doing is that it's causing your soils to become more saline. And that is, again, changing completely the chemistry of your soil. So there's some crops that will not grow that well. There's some crops that will not grow at all because you now have significant salinization of your soil. So again, the impact on food and water security, impact on agriculture is significant. Increased incidence of pests and diseases. You have more pests and diseases because the ecosystem is changing. You have migration of certain pests. So you will start to see that, and that is something that will be very problematic for you as farmers because, one, the impact on your yield, the impact on the quality of your produce, but also the impact on your bottom line, because you now have to be spending money to get rid of whether it's aphids or whatever else you're dealing with. An increased incidence of pests and diseases is something that you will have to contend with. Ocean acidification, as I mentioned earlier, the oceans are becoming more acidic, and that is impacting food security. So if you're a fisher and you're going out to sea, you'll find that some of the fish that you'd normally be catching, or the seafood that you'd normally, the shellfish, sorry, that you'd normally be harvesting, you're not getting them anymore because the oceans are becoming more acidic, and that is causing a change in the chemistry of that marine ecosystem. And equally problematic is ocean warming. As our oceans become warmer, you find that many of our migratory species, our pelagics, will probably start moving out of these oceans and going somewhere else, because the temperature, even at depth, is too warm. So that will again cause a complete change in the makeup of the animal species, the fish that you see there. So really, to respond adequately to climate change, we have to mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases and adapt to the impacts. So like I said, today was just really to walk you through what is climate change, when we speak of some of the phrases, what we're talking about, and how is climate change impacting you and likely to impact you, not just as a farmer, but as a human being living in a Caribbean island. On Thursday, we will look at the solutions. How do we adapt? What do we do? How can we lessen those impacts? How can we lessen the severity of those impacts? So we'll dive a little bit more deeply into that. So that is the end of the presentation for today. We have time, quite a bit of time, so we can take some questions and on what we discussed.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher. We'll take those questions with persons whose hands are raised. So we'll go first with Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson, Kia. Okay, then we'll come back to Ms. Johnson, and then we'll go at Alberta. I'm not too sure if they're hearing me. Alberta? Okay, so let's move on to Cynthia Spencer.
Good evening, Dr. Fletcher.
Good evening.
How are you, sir?
I am doing well, thank you.
I must say that I am very, very pleased with your presentation. I did not know a lot of things about climate change, and I guess we really need to educate a lot of us in St. Lucia, and I guess everywhere in the Caribbean. But, I have a concern, our sea level in Castries. I never knew that's what, even if we did not see the rain, we noticed water rising in the Castries Basin a lot. And I'm now understanding why. Okay. And another thing, our fish in the ocean. I don't know when last I saw flying fish. So is it the cause of all this happening to us that the fishes move somewhere else?
The flying fish, thank you, Cynthia. The flying fish issue is one, it's not just St. Lucia. Barbados is not seeing flying fish. And Barbados' national dish is flying fish and cocoa. So Barbados is not seeing flying fish. I think it's a combination of ocean temperatures, but also overfishing. There is something going on there that I haven't paid sufficient attention to tell you definitively that it is warmer oceans, warmer temperatures, or that it is overfishing that has taken place. And that's something we always have to be very, very wary of. And that's why our fisheries department are very, very concerned about keeping closed seasons for lobster and other marine species to ensure that there isn't overfishing. But you are right. I mean, and that is something that we will see increasingly, that fishers have to be going further and further out for them to get the same catch, because the chemistry of the ocean is warmer and it's starting to get more acidic. In fact, I saw something that said in the Pacific, the oceans are starting to get so acidic that Dungeness crabs, their shells are starting to melt. It's becoming difficult for them to form shells, and that's scary. With respect to sea level rise, yes, we are seeing sea level rise, and there are sites that you could go on to, and you could do simulations of what sea level rise would look like. And I remember I did a presentation in the Cayman Islands earlier this year, and I showed them what would happen to some of the islands and some of the communities in Cayman. And also I did one in the Bahamas also this year and showing them. And it's scary. I mean, there are places where you will find at 2 degrees Celsius, some parts of the island that you are used to and people live will be underwater. I did one for St. Lucia, and I think at 3 degrees Celsius, the view fort, the water will be completely across the runway. So a part of view fort will be separated. That little piece of view fort at the end will be separated from the rest of the mainland, because that middle part will be completely underwater from Sandy Beach going across. I suspect it must be Sandy Beach going across to maybe Bruceville. I can't remember exactly where, but that area will be underwater. And for many of our islands, that's going to be a serious issue. And that's not something that I think any one of us want to have to deal with. So it's scary. What makes it even scarier is the fact that there's nothing that we can do about it, because we're not the ones causing the problem. All we can do is seek for funding to be able to put proper sea defenses in place. But there's a limit to what those sea defenses will do. You can't build a wall across the entire island. So it's not a good situation. If we do not do what needs to be done now, we will find that in 20, 30, your grandchildren will be living in a totally different country than the one you live right now,
And one more. Thank you very much. The cutting down of our trees. I always knew something was wrong, but now, you explaining everything, okay, shows how lack of knowledge, what causes damage to our country, our islands. Look, we are building everything. Every hotel must be by the sea. This is so strange, okay? We don't even have access to our beaches now, but look at what's happening during the hurricane season. Okay, let me tell you, I really am appreciative of this lecture today. I look forward for the next class, but I've learned a lot and I can share what I know there, Dr. Fletcher. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For you explaining so much. I know we're gonna get this presentation center so I can go over it again. Okay, so nice seeing you.
Thanks. But you're right about the hotels, because it doesn't make sense. We know that the beaches on which these hotels are being built will be inundated. These beaches will suffer. They'll be the first to suffer from sea level rise, but not just sea level rise. Anytime a strong hurricane passes through, you have storm surge that batters those beaches and batters all of those buildings. So it does not make sense to continue to put very expensive, high density buildings on a beach that will be impacted by climate change and by sea level rise. And we have to get our tourists to understand that, yes, I know you want to walk out of your room and curl your toes in the sand, but that is not something that is in your best interest. So maybe you walk across the road and then go to the sand, like you have in some countries. For example, in Brazil, you go to Rio de Janeiro, and you have some of the most beautiful beaches in Rio de Janeiro, in Copacabana and Ipanema, but there isn't one hotel built on the beach. All of the hotels are behind the road, and then you walk onto the beach. So there's nothing to be worried about for sea level rise. Yes, okay, you lose some of your beach, but you will not lose expensive assets, and you certainly will not be putting people's lives at risk. So you're right. We know about climate change, but we are not making decisions that suggest we understanding what climate change will do to us. So many of our decisions, many of our planning decisions are not being done with climate change in mind, unfortunately.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We'll move on to Annie.
Hi, good night, everyone. Hope you're hearing me.
We are.
I have a question. Also, I think a level of frustration. And I just want to thank you, Doctor, for the lecture tonight. I have been through different lecture in terms of climate, what you would have presented here tonight. And my question is, because what is in place? What is being done to hold these countries accountable, that we are pointing out all the time, that are contributing to the climate change and affecting us in the Caribbean? And just went through Hurricane Beryl myself on the island of Myro, here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and saw the utter destruction. And, you know, you look and you see maybe some of the folks who are go to the Paris Agreement, these things that they put in place to talk about climate change. And yet some of those in leadership are still coming back from these things and doing things that are causing climate problem and doing projects, and you wonder where is the proper environmental impact assessment. And I get frustrated at times, I would tell you. So I want to know if there's documents and what is being done to hold these countries accountable.
Thank you, Annie. That's a brilliant question. So you have two levels of people that you have to hold accountable. First of all, you have those who have caused the problem. So the big countries, the large emitters that have caused this problem and who continue to put out levels of greenhouse gases, burning fossil fuels, and are causing this problem to not get better, but to get worse. How do we hold them accountable? And that really is the biggest problem. That we have this every year. Between 40 and 50,000 people go to one country to negotiate climate change agreements. And you have countries in there who are negotiating that are major causes of the problem. So their economy is based on oil and gas. They export oil and gas, and they do not want to see anything done that will cause them to lose their economic power and to lose their jobs and the jobs of the people and the wealth that they've accumulated. So they're not going to be helpful to you. There are also countries that have historically been part of the problem. So when you start talking about, okay, how are you going to compensate us? They back off and say, oh, no, we're not talking about compensation here at all. One of the most difficult things, you heard me talk about loss and damage. I was leading the Caribbean's delegation to COP21 when we negotiated the Paris Agreement. And the developed countries did not want to see anything in there that spoke about loss and damage. Why? Because they were petrified that that would then lead to a discussion about liability and compensation. Because if we're agreeing that there's loss and damage, if we're agreeing that you are doing things to which we cannot adapt and which are causing loss of lives, livelihoods, species going extinct, all the people losing their culture, then there has to be some sort of compensation. We can't just be talking about these things and saying, okay, you've done that, so let's write it down in a notebook that you've done it and we turn our backs. So they did not want to have any discussion about liability and compensation. And that was the most difficult thing for us. So what do? They talk about putting financing systems in place and making finance available to you. But what finance do they make available to you? In Copenhagen in 2009, they agreed, the developed countries agreed that from 2020, they would make available $100 billion every year to developing countries to help them adapt to the impacts of climate change and also transition their economies away from using fossil fuels. Now, let's see what they've done. Have they kept that promise? From 2020, they have never in any year from 2020 to 2023 mobilized the $100 billion that they said they would. When they've given us money, a lot of the money has been more of the money has been in the form of loans than in the form of grants. So the same countries that caused the problem are saying to us that, okay, if you want to deal with the problem, you have to borrow money from us so that you can solve the problem. So we cause the problem, you borrow money from us, you pay us interest. So that's the equivalent of somebody breaking your leg and telling you that the cast that you will need to put on your leg to get that bone to heal, and the crutches that you will need to walk on, you could get them, but you have to buy them or rent them from me. And I'm the one who broke your leg in the first place. So last year, after a long time, we got them to agree to a loss and damage fund. You know how long it took us to get that loss and damage fund? The first time Small Island Developing States, SIDS, proposed a loss and damage fund. In fact, they wanted it for insurance for sea level rise. So to be able to create an insurance mechanism so that countries that were experiencing sea level rise could get some kind of payout. The first time that was proposed was in 1991. It took us 32 years to get a loss and damage fund agreed to by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change by the COP. 32 years. You know how much damage has happened during that time? The Paris Agreement that we agreed to in 2015 and we signed and was ratified in 2016 and came into force, while it is something that we're all very proud of, the Paris Agreement is a gentleman and a gentlewoman's agreement. You cannot hold anybody accountable under the Paris Agreement because it is voluntary. What you see happening now, however, is that countries are now going to the International Court of Justice and saying, look, if a country by its actions is causing damage to my economy, is creating conditions that are making it difficult for my people to earn a livelihood, is causing the death of many of my citizens through these hurricanes and typhoons that are passing, then I need to be able to hold them responsible for that. So this is now being litigated in the International Court of Justice, and we're keeping very close watch on what comes out of that to see whether in those international courts we can now start holding those countries and those companies that you saw me list, like Exxon and all of them, holding them accountable for this, because this is something Small Island Developing States have been saying from day one, that you cannot continue to cause the problem. But there's nothing that we can do. We just have to show up every year, show up in another country, ourselves spending endless money and increasing our carbon footprint because we have to fly from St. Vincent to Baku, Azerbaijan, which is a very, very far distance to go to negotiate for two weeks and to come out with nothing. So we're now saying, okay, let's start litigating. Let's start seeing how we can take these people to court and seeing how we can get something from it. And to be honest, my opinion is that that's the only time you will start seeing action. Because if you remember what happened with the tobacco industry years ago, when people were saying that, look, people are dying, getting cancer from tobacco smoke and secondhand smoke. And the tobacco industry was saying, no. The cancers, throat cancer and lung cancer that people are getting, that has nothing to do with our product. That has nothing to do with cigarettes and cigarette smoking. It was only when these people were taken to court and the court ruled and you had these class action suits and they then started having to pay millions and millions and millions of dollars, then they started putting the warning labels and doing all of the other things that caused us to see a change in the way in which the tobacco industry operates. So it cannot advertise, it can't do all of these things anymore. I think the same thing has to happen with the oil and gas sector, with fossil fuels. It is only when we take them to court and they now have to start paying money for the damage that they're causing in our respective countries that you will see a change. Now, going to the second part of your question, our own leaders who unfortunately are still doing things that are causing the impacts of climate change to be worsened in our respective countries, that baffles me, because we are the same ones who are out there talking about there is loss and damage and there's sea level rise and parts of my country will be underwater and my agriculture sector will be impacted. But we're clearing mangroves to put marinas. We are signing and giving planning permission to big hotel chains to put hotels right on the beach when we know that that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. We had a situation in St. Lucia where we had some serious flooding. And, you know, I said it very, very humorously, but it was a very serious thing. We had flooding in the north of the island from a freak weather system in November. And these systems are becoming less and less freak. They're becoming more and more frequent. And there was flooding in 2 areas. The 2 areas are known, the communities are known. The name is Grand Riviere and Riviere Mita. Now, if you St. Lucian and you speak Creole, you will know that Grand Riviere means big river, Grand River, and Riviere Mita means the middle of the river. So there's a reason our ancestors, our foreparents, called those areas those names, because they knew that in the past that those were the floodplain. Grand Riviere was the floodplain, that when there was big water coming down, that entire part was underwater. Riviere Mita was the middle of the river. That was where the river passed. So if you now build communities in those areas, when you have serious flooding, water will always take the route of least resistance, the route that it knows. And if it just so happens that your home or your stadium or whatever is in that place that that water is accustomed to passing, I'm sorry, but it will go and it will pass through there. So we ourselves continue to make those decisions because we arrogantly believe that we can retrain a river, we can cause nature to behave differently because we have the technology. And we continue to not understand and not learn from our mistakes. This new era that we're in, this climate change era that we're in, requires us to do things differently. If we do not do things differently, then we will pay for it with our livelihoods, we'll pay for it with our lives, unfortunately. So you're absolutely right. We have to see more climate-informed decision-making taking place in our own country. So it's not just the international community that's at fault, but we are also at fault for the way in which we continue to do things as if climate change is just something that we talk about in a conference, but is not impacting us already in our respective countries. So, excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you can understand my frustration.
I can.
Wait.
Okay, thank you so much. Lucina, you can go ahead.
Hi, good night. Good night. Just something you said, and in speaking about climate change, when you said mentioned sea level rise. Yes. I'm from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and in Sandy Bay, well, I was a part of a video production where we were looking at the impact of climate change on the northeast coast in St. Vincent. And in Sandy Bay, they are actually losing land to the sea. So where there was land, the sea literally just took it over. In 2013, I remember being out there and being a part of a summer program, and there was a big field where the children used to go and play football. And this year, when I went out there, half the field is gone. And when I asked, where is it? They said the sea just came and took it. I said, what do you mean the sea just took it? They say, yeah, it just came and took it. So when the volcano erupted in 2021, the ash that they removed from the community, they said they dump it there to try and build back build it up. And again, the sea came and it just took it. In Georgetown, they're basically encouraging trucks, when trucks pass with rubbish, to go up to Rabaka to just go and dump them. They will tell them, dump them here in order to build back, prevent the part of the beach from going away. So they keep dumping things there, and the sea keep coming and taking it. So the impact of climate change, it is real. In Kingston, where I am, I'm not really seeing the loss of land. But when you go out to the countryside, you're seeing it. We're feeling it as in the heat, but not many people really, they don't realize, okay, this is climate change. But I think there needs to be more education. It's real crazy to see.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're right. Absolutely right. Absolutely.
If I may chime in, so I know for a fact that I'm from St. Vincent too, and I'm living in Fancy. So I know for a fact that whenever we have what we call building up of coastal defense in certain areas, then the sea itself will encroach on areas that are exposed. So let's say we are building sea defense in Georgetown. Obviously the water is going to look for a different means of landing in or gaining access, because it's like you're pushing out and it's going to look for another means of encroaching on the land that is exposed and open. So you're saying that the sea took the land. We have sea defense being done here in St. Vincent at certain areas. So the encroachment is going to take place wherever the ocean can start, going further inland. Yeah.
Mhm.
Just one thing. Well, because I was speaking to a guy who lived close by the sea, and what he was saying is he was basically saying he started seeing it from since 2000, around 1999, 2000. So it was happening before a lot of these sea defense projects came along. And that guy that I spoke to, he lives in Georgetown, very close to where the erosion is taking place.
Yeah.
Other questions? The other hands up.
Well, I will now go back to Kia Johnson. If you can hear me, would you like to proceed with your question, please? Okay, Alberta. Okay. Well, Janice, you can go ahead. You're still muted, Janice.
Hello, good evening, Dr. Fletcher, and to everyone else. I'm talking climate change in terms of rainfall. I noticed that rain falls in patches, and you would be in Beaufort and it would be raining, and you would drive down to Dennery and Dennery would not have rain. But lately, I have noticed something. When it rains, like I live in Castries, I live at Levancy, and it's raining in town, and I could see and hear the rain, but it's not raining in Levancy. It is quite interesting because sometimes I wish I could make a video.
Yeah, the climate change is completely interfering with the water cycle. Because, and you're seeing it if you're a farmer, you're seeing it with how you're seeing blooms and crops that you used to have a very distinct mango season before. You knew that you would get mangoes after the onset of the rains because the water is the trigger for the production of flowers, and then you get mangoes. Now you get mangoes throughout the year because you have these cycles of drought, then rain, drought, and then rain. And it just shows you how much our water cycle, our hydrological cycle has just changed because the seasons for so many of our crops. And I think that is the easiest way of seeing just how much the water cycle has changed in all of our countries.
Thank you very much.
You're
All
welcome.
right. Thank you. Decima, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, good night. Very, very interesting presentation. I have one is a comment and one is a question. In 2013, we had what was referred to as a trough system, which impacted St. Lucia and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and we did suffer significant loss and damage to both countries. What was interesting about that phenomenon is no one saw it coming, and and you made an interesting point where you said the river and how the river went back to its natural course. And we lost, it's about 13 people got killed. I don't know how many died in St. Lucia. But the river, when we saw how the rivers all over the country, the waterways was so full that all the rivers were just going crazy, and they just went back to what they were doing before. So where they had sort of trained it, so to speak, it did what it wanted to do. But so that was my way of comment. The other thing is that I know in terms of a global percentage, the region's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is not as significant. But I am believing that in terms of trend, I'm sure that in terms of how much we are also putting into the atmosphere has increased. And if you have seen, I mean, I probably would like to get my hand on it to see in terms of how much we in the region are putting into the atmosphere.
Clearly, Decima, our greenhouse gas emissions have gone up because we are becoming more developed. We have more industrial activity taking place in our respective countries. We have more cars on the road in our respective countries. Our electricity consumption is going up for different reasons. Population is growing. Certain parts of the country that were not electrified before, be it with street lights or just penetration of the grid, are now electrified, so that the situation now in 2024 is significantly different to what it was, let's say, in 2000. So you have that happening, but that is happening worldwide. So yes, our production, our absolute production of greenhouse gases has increased, but our percentage-wise, it hasn't, because everybody else that's happening everywhere else. There are very few countries where you see a regression, where you see less electrification or fewer cars on the road. So yeah, our production of greenhouse gases has increased because countries that are becoming more developed, countries that are becoming more populated, or at least in some instances, some of our countries are actually depopulating. But you have that. But the absolute percentage, our percentage contribution to the global inventory of greenhouse gases, I would say that, with the exception of Guyana, that has now become a significant oil and gas producer. Barbados, well, probably not even so much Barbados, because what has happened in Barbados is that while Barbados's activities have intensified, there's something very interesting going on in Barbados, because Prime Minister Motley made a statement, I think it was last year or whatever, or maybe a year before, that the sun and the wind are God's gift to us, and you should not have to be applying for licenses and going through any complicated regulatory apparatus for you to put solar panels on your rooftop. If you land in Barbados now, the same way maybe 2 decades ago, you saw every roof in Barbados with a solar water heater. Now, a large percentage of roofs in Barbados have solar PV panels, to the extent where it's causing a problem for the grid for Barbados Light and Power, because there's just so much renewable energy that's being now put back onto the grid that the grid is just not modern enough and is not able to satisfy those inputs that are coming in. So you have that. You do have that, while in some instances you have more intense electrification taking place, but you also have in some countries more application of solar, or well, not so much wind, with the exception of, I think, St. Kitts and Nevis, but you do have more renewable energy coming on. So I think that is offsetting it. But on a percentage basis, I don't think so. I don't think on a percentage basis our contribution has increased much more than what I showed you. I think it was 0.116 or something like that, or 0.166. I don't think it's increased. It's increased more than that.
No, I suspect it had not increased, because if the amount globally is increasing, then our percentage probably may even go down. But I don't want us to go away feeling that our contribution to the problem, we are also contributing it. It may be small, but as you say, one fills basket. Yeah. So whatever we can do, and especially I had a conversation with someone some time ago, and I said to her, the place is hotter. She doesn't live in the region, and she said to me, no. I said, well, you can't tell me. I live here, and in December 2023, that is what I remember. December 2023, we had temperatures that felt as if we were in August and in September.
Yeah.
It was unheard of.
Particularly on nighttime temperatures. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. You are absolutely right. We are, but there's another reason why we should not be complacent and say, okay, we're not contributing to the problem. Because you see, for us, moving away from fossil fuels is not as much a climate change imperative as it is an economic imperative. And that's the point that internally we've always made. When you are paying between 35 and 40 US cents per kilowatt hour, so 1 EC dollar, you're paying 1 EC dollar per kilowatt hour for electricity, compared to Trinidad and Tobago, that is charging its consumers maybe 7 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's what? That's like 20 cents, 20 cents EC for less than 20 cents EC for electricity. It means now that there's nothing that you can do that will require energy that will be competitive. So if you are in agriculture and you want to do value added, you want to do agro-processing, you need energy for agro-processing. But you cannot compete with any agro-processing operation in Trinidad and Tobago, because the cost of energy for agro-processing in Trinidad and Tobago is 1/5 of the cost of energy for agro-processing in Grenada, in St. Vincent, in St. Kitts, in St. Lucia. If you are running a small hotel, a guest house, you need electricity for you to power your fans. These days, fans not working because all they're doing is circulating hot air. So you need to power your AC units. You need to do your laundry. You need to power your clothes dryers. Then your operation as a small hotel are more expensive than somebody operating a small hotel in a place where they are not paying as much for electricity. So that's why, for us, moving away from fossil fuels is as much an economic imperative as it is a climate change imperative. Because if we can now say, you know what, we're using solar and we're using wind, and we can cap the price of electricity at, let's say, instead of 1 EC dollar per kilowatt hour, let's say it's now down to 60 cents per kilowatt hour, then you're more competitive. So there is every single reason, quite apart from the fact that, yeah, we're not big contributors, but there is every economic reason for us to move away from using fossil fuels, because the quicker we do it, the more money we'll have in our pockets, whether you are just an ordinary household and you're looking for money so you could do other things with it, or if you're a small business owner and you want to grow your business or you want to expand into markets that really the cost of production because of energy will not allow you to right now. So you're right. We should not be complacent and figure, boy, we're not users of electricity, so let's just continue to burn, baby, burn, as Mr. Trump says, drill, baby, drill. So that doesn't make sense. You're right.
Thank you.
Thank
Moving
you.
on to the next question. Kitisha, would you like to go ahead with your question?
Hello, good night.
Right.
I heard an analogy made of somebody's leg being broken and you are made to pay the cost. And I I visualize that as the very case that's happening in our parts of the world, because if we are emitting less of these greenhouse gases and nobody is made, and I'm going to use the word made again, made to compensate, then what say do we even have when we go to these conventions and all of that? My question is then, who do we target to have our small nations compensated, because we are really affected? And how do we go about doing that, if it's at all possible? And secondly, in St. Vincent, for example, I find that our fuel surcharge is really ridiculous. Being a case where we use a lot of hydro, powered stations and so on, I find it puzzling that sometimes we pay so much for fuel when we are capable of using solar energy. And in my opinion, much of what we get comes from the hydro plants, using the rivers and so on. So even the consumers, sometimes we feel like we don't have a say when we know things are not balancing out. You see certain actions being taken, and yet the bill is being passed down to almost people who have no voice. So I don't know, not just in the case of agriculture, because as you said, processing, if you're going to actually make use of electricity to produce stuff, it means you, as you say, somebody said the dance can before the light. So it's really frustrating, as somebody said. And I think sometimes we talk a lot, but I like to look for solutions, and I think we should be focusing on how we could really be solving some of these issues on a regional level, perhaps, and then holding the major producers accountable.
Yeah. So thank you, Katisha. Two excellent questions. On the question of compensation, there are two ways to look at it. One, that you continue to plod through with our negotiations at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, but that's only going to get you so far. And there are people who go to these negotiations. There are countries who send delegates to these negotiations with one goal only, and that is to make sure that no progress is made that would cause them to have to spend any more money than they want to spend. You have now a lot of fossil fuel lobbyists going to these negotiations. I think the last count, there were like 2,000, almost 2,500 lobbyists from fossil fuel companies that are now attending climate change talks. That's like arms dealers going to a negotiation for peace. They don't have any interest in peace. They make their money from selling arms. And the people who are, if you have fossil fuel lobbyists showing up at a convention to talk about reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, then you basically are talking about them losing their business. So they can only be there for one reason, and that is to ensure that the status quo is preserved, which is why I believe that you need a parallel track for this, that you must have litigation, that, what Vanuatu and Antigua started with referring this case to the International Court of Justice to give an opinion on whether countries are now liable for causing damage as a result of climate change to other countries. And once you found them liable, what kind of compensation? The next question would be compensation. What kind of compensation would come? I think that is an arm that has to be pursued. There's an interesting branch of science that is evolving and developing called attribution science. And what attribution science is now allowing scientists to do is to look at a particular event, a particular weather event, and determine how much that weather event was worsened as a result of climate change. So they can look at Hurricane Maria that hit Dominica and say that Hurricane Maria was, let's just pull a number out of thin air. Hurricane Maria was made 25% worse as a result of climate change. Now, that's extremely important because you see, prior to that, it would have been very difficult to make any case for liability and compensation because you would not be able to attribute the damage that you're experiencing to climate change. They will tell you, but you've had hurricanes in the Caribbean from time immemorial. The Caribbean is in the hurricane belt. From the time Christopher Columbus came into the Caribbean, there were hurricanes that were damaging his ship. So why all of a sudden you want to say it's climate change or this cause that? Well, we are now capable of deconstructing those extreme weather events and determining how much of that extreme weather event was worsened by climate change. And that's a level of analysis that I really would like to see our regional organizations, universities, and others take on with a lot more seriousness, so that we can determine every single weather event we have. It could be a drought in St. Kitts, or flooding in Trinidad and Tobago, or a hurricane Beryl that just caused havoc in Grenada and St. Vincent. How much of that was caused by climate change? So we can make a case, because we have it's unconscionable for us to continue to be impacted year after year and just not be able to do anything about it. Just pick up the pieces and start all over again. And the same countries are telling us, well, you have high debt to GDP ratios. You know why we have high debt to GDP ratios? Yeah, okay. Some of our governments borrow money a little bit irresponsibly. That's true. But in many cases, the high debt to GDP ratios that we have are because the governments have to borrow money to recover from extreme weather events. Don't mind that you hear World Bank and others come in and give you money. The amount of money that any government, St. Vincent, Grenada, St. Lucia, Bahamas, is able to mobilize after the passage of a hurricane is a small percentage of the total requirement for that country to recover completely. So the governments invariably, almost inevitably, have to borrow money to recover. The more they borrow is the more they find themselves in debt, because that money has to be repaid. So that is something that nobody's taking into account, and that is causing serious hardship for the countries. Your other question about the fuel surcharge is a very important one. Now, knowledge is power. And I think what we have to do, and that's something that I've been doing with my Caribbean Climate Justice Project, and also Youth IRE, which is Youth Innovators for Renewable and Inclusive Energy, which is working with civil society so that we educate civil society so that they know what the information is and what kind of recourse that they have. So the organization that I chair right now, called CCRE, the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, every year puts out something called energy report cards. And these energy report cards look at the energy situation in every single CARICOM country and tell you what is going on, how much of the generation is from renewable sources, so how much is from hydro in the case of St. Vincent, or in the case of Dominica, how much is from diesel, and what are the inefficiencies, so what are the losses experienced by the utility company. So when you have that information, plus hopefully VINLEC, in your case, your Vincentian, so VINLEC would publish its an annual report that would give you some information, not all, but it would give you some information. So what you have to do now is see how you can now start inquiring about what VINLEC is doing, what VINLEC is charging, and how fair that is. Now, the challenge with VINLEC is that VINLEC is a government-owned and operated utility company, and there isn't an independent regulator for VINLEC. The regulator for VINLEC is the government. So the government will determine what the tariff is, etc. So it means now getting information on VINLEC's operations is as much information as the government will put out on VINLEC. So that's the only challenge that you have. I don't know how much information is there on VINLEC, but you should be able to look at that fuel surcharge and determine, okay, does that fuel surcharge make sense, given, as you said, there's a significant percentage of the generation that's coming from hydro. Now, bear in mind, however, that climate change will impact production from hydro, because as rivers are flowing, yes, let's not just put that there, correct. As rivers, as you have decline in stream flows, then VINLEC has to rely less and less on hydro, because it's just not getting that stream of water to turn those turbines, and it has to now depend more on diesel generation. So climate change there is causing VINLEC to change its business case to move away from hydro, because it's just, and I'm sure during the dry season, some of the sources for hydro are just not productive. So it has to be moving more to diesel generation. So again, that could be one of the reasons. And I'm sure if you look at an annual report, hopefully the annual report would provide you with that sort of granular detail that would allow you to make those sorts of comparisons.
All right, thank you very much. Cassandra, would you like to go ahead? Cassandra? If you're speaking, we're not hearing you. Cassandra? Okay. Deborah, do you like to go ahead, please?
Yes, hold on one second. I just wanted to say thank you very much for the presentation. It was really very informative, and some of the things that you talked about, I have read about myself, and I have listened to conversations about some of the consequences. It is a serious problem, and you have made it very clear that it is intensifying faster than ever before. And you know, 23 and 24, there have been things that have happened in 23 and 24 regarding the climate and other things that have shown that it's intensifying. The first summit for climate change took place in 1979. I was doing a little bit of research, but imagine that since 1979 to now, progress has been so very slow, and the problems of loss of land, displacement of peoples, food security, threat to our very existence and the planet are scary. And you use scary so many times, it's scary, to say the least. So my question is, what do you see as necessary actions by governments that need to be taken by governments to mitigate and turn things around? We may be small islands, but perhaps there are things that we can do to educate citizens, educate children, because I think schools need to sort of focus on this as well in a big way. It's sort of not probably brought to the attention as it should be. And I was wondering, what are your ideas? What are some of the things you think at the ground zero level that ordinary citizens can begin to do? And governments need to start using their social media and their all kinds of media in order to raise awareness of the problem. And people need to take action. We need to get together in groups and do things, because the problem is getting more and more serious. And for me, I don't see the changes are happening fast enough. We're going to be extinct before we know it. So what do you think?
Yeah. Thanks, Deborah. Awesome question. There are a couple of things, and you kind of answered the question. Public education and public awareness, that is so important. We have to get people to understand. Every time I do one of these sessions and people tell me, boy, I learned so much and this is so informative, I'm happy. But it also tells me just how much of an information gap there is, because these issues are issues that should really be fundamental and that should be on the tip of the tongue of almost everybody who lives in the Caribbean, because we are at ground zero of the fight against climate change. We're the ones who are being impacted. But it's unfortunate that it's a subject that so many know so little of. About that. Yes, we kind of know that the heat and the sea level rise, but when we get into not as much technical detail, I don't expect anybody to be able to, or most people to be able to do a presentation like I just did, but at least to understand the dynamics, what's happening. There is still such a big education gap that we need to go. And that's why I've spent so much time. And, whenever I'm asked to do this, I do it, because I think that is probably one of the most important missions that I have, to get Caribbean people to understand the severity of this problem and to see what they can do at the community level, but also what they can do with advocacy. Because we have to ensure that climate change and sustainable development are issues that matter politically, so that the same way that we make noise about education, and quite rightly so, about unemployment and healthcare and the state of our roads and everything else, we are supposed to be asking our politicians, what are you doing about advocacy where climate change is concerned? It cannot just be that we are satisfied as leaders showing up once a year in a different country to speak very, very eloquently and very passionately about climate change and pat ourselves on the shoulder because Reuters and BBC and Associated Press and others have carried our speech, and we've sounded really good, and then we go back and we do nothing for the next year. So where that is concerned, our politicians, and I'm not just talking about our leaders, I'm talking about all our politicians, opposition, ministers, all of our leaders, need to make climate change an issue that is always on the tip of their tongue. Doesn't matter what you're talking about. So if the Minister of Agriculture is in a discussion with his colleagues, be it within Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, or CADI, or IECA, that conversation has to come back to climate change. And the Minister of Agriculture, in talking about, yes, I need more seeds, I need more varieties, I need more planting material, I need farm equipment, I need fertilizer, but I also need to know what can be done about climate change, because these cultivars, these seeds you're giving me for these cultivars, those seeds will fail because I don't have enough water to be able to keep them through the life cycle, or the temperatures are now so hot that that particular variety will not give me much of a yield because it is not acclimated to these new temperatures. When your Minister of Health is discussing at PAHO or WHO, that Minister of Health, she should be saying to her colleagues at PAHO that, look, climate change is causing an increase in mental unwellness in my country. I've worked in countries after the passage of a hurricane, and the PTSD that people have suffered is palpable. You could tell that there was need for psychological first aid, because I've worked with people, and you could trying to reconstruct what happened, and they start crying. And that's for a hurricane that happened over a year ago. Farmers who've lost their entire crop as a result of a drought. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that people who have respiratory problems now have to be dealing with more particulate matter in the atmosphere because of all these forest fires that we have? So your Minister of Health has to make climate change an issue every time he or she speaks. Same thing with your Minister of Tourism. But even more importantly, your Prime Ministers speak very well on climate change every year at COP. But when I listen to them throughout the year, I don't hear that same level of passion about climate change, because there's so many other things that they're dealing with. And we have to remind our politicians that if we say and we agree that climate change is the existential threat confronting our region, it is a life and death matter. As we saw when Beryl passed, it was a life and death matter. So if it is that's what we agree on, then why aren't we talking climate change every time we have a bilateral meeting with New Zealand or the UK or the US? Why are we not talking climate change? And so the public awareness has to go at the grassroots level, at the community level, so that people can understand what this is about and why they need to take it seriously, and why they need to make their leaders accountable for the decisions that they make. But also our leaders need to understand that climate change is not a seasonal matter, that water scarcity is not a seasonal matter, and we should not be worried about the insufficiency of our water during the dry season. But then once the rain starts, like we're going through a rainy season right now, forget about the fact that we are still living in a water insecure country. And once January hits, our farmers, our schools, all of these people who depend on water on a daily basis will not have water. So we should be talking about these things constantly. So I think that's where the public awareness and the public education comes in. That's why I've spent a lot of time with civil society, trying to educate civil society about this so that they can speak from an informed position. But I really would like, to start, when I give those lectures for somebody, when I give these presentations, not lectures, when I give these presentations, for somebody to say to me, yeah, I know that already. Okay, so now what? What are we going to do? What action are we going to take? Because we know that. Unfortunately, I'm still at a point where when I give the presentation, people are saying, wow, this is scary. Wow, I didn't know that. And that's good. That's good. But I want more people to tell me, okay, we know that already. What do we do? So, and that's why the public education, public awareness is so important.
I totally agree with you. And what I think what is coming through in some of the things that you've said is that it needs to be part of every decision that is being made throughout all the ministries in government, because it affects everybody. It is something that is a web that is affecting the whole environment, everything that we do. So it needs to be at the foundation of everything that is all decisions that are being made. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're right.
Right.
Climate change is not an environmental issue. Climate change is a whole of country, whole of economy. It's a social issue, it's an environmental issue, it's an economic issue, a political issue.
All right, thank you so much. Given the interest of time, we'll take the one question from Cordia that's in the chat, and then we'll ask Albert and Annie to ask their question, and then we'll conclude there. So Cordia had asked a question regarding lessening the carbon emissions and mitigating consumerism. How would that affect our economy?
Well, there are many, many, many opportunities to move away from the extractive economy that most of our countries, that's the development model, into a circular economy. You see, we cannot expect to have a viable economy if it is that our consumerism is based on products that are being manufactured in another part of the world. If it is that St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Lucia, Grenada is like China, and it has a market for the products that it is producing. That's a different kettle of fish, because you are consuming your own products. These are products that you have made. So if you now decide to scale back on consumption, then you're affecting your own production. But if we scale back on consumption of those items, we are not affecting our production. That production is coming from somewhere else. So we have to see how we can now, delving a little bit into what I will discuss on Thursday, but we have to see how we can create a circular economy, how we can create jobs, green jobs that are more enduring, that will not damage our economy, damage our ecosystems the way this development model that we have is doing. So I think there are many of the opportunities there in the energy sector. There are opportunities there in the blue economy. There are opportunities there in the green economy, in some of the products that we grow and the products that we market. There are many opportunities there. We have to see how we can also collectively harness our resources. You know, in the Windward Islands, we had an industry that worked very well. Granted, it was protected, but even with the protection, the only reason we're able to sustain it is because we were producing as a collective and marketing as a collective. And I'm talking about bananas. We had a banana industry for the 4 Windward Islands. Grenada dropped out early because of the presence of Moco disease, but Dominica, St. Vincent, and St. Lucia kept that industry going because they were producing together and marketing together. We have abandoned that. It worked in bananas, but we have abandoned it for agriculture since then. Everybody's trying to do it themselves, so that institutional architecture that, you know, worked so well, we haven't tried to replicate it. And I think those are some of the things that we need to look at. How do we now start producing so that we can penetrate a market and sustain that market? I am sorry, I don't care who it is. It could be Grenada with nutmeg, it could be St. Vincent of arrowroot, it could be St. Lucia with bananas. There is no market that we will be able, unless it's a very small niche market, that we will be able to sustain. However, if we look to see how can we pull production, then that might be something that is possible. So, you know, yes, there will be some change in the structure of our economy, but I think it will be a good change if we focus on great jobs and enduring jobs and jobs that are done using products that are endemic to us, that we now see how we market. And like I said, on Thursday, I'll get into a little bit of that as a response to climate change.
All right, thank you. Alberto, would you like to go ahead if you're hearing me? Would you like to ask your question, please? If not, then I'm going to lower your hand and ask Annie to ask a question.
Hi, good night again. Sorry for jumping in again, but I want to say, because you mentioned, Dr. Fletcher, about psychological forces. And I say I have to come in and thank Helen's daughter, for providing that psychological foresight for us who came out of burial. And I'm really looking forward for the other sessions that will come. you know, and the psychological foresight that is not being provided for people in the Grenadines, especially on Myro, it is really causing an effect. And, you know, I was saying to myself, I like to do farming, I like to do my gardening, I like to grow my own stuff. And I was just thinking my energy, my passion for the agriculture is kind of low, given the coming out of burial. And I was asking myself, how my plants are going to respond when I, as a farmer, is stressed out, and the plants are stressed too because of the climate. So it's a whole thing there, not with us as human and our energy and how we affect the plants. And I'm like, I have not even been so motivated to get back into the garden, and it's a whole lot. And I thank Helen Daughter for that. My question to the group is, we talk about all this accountability, and as Dr. Fletcher mentioned, are there folks among us who will be willing to get together to be climate activists, to be able to hold our local government accountable to the research, to understand what is going on, and to lobby on the local front? Because at the end of the day, we get information, and as Dr. Fletcher was saying, what are we going to do with it? So that's a question for us as a group. And yeah, again, I want to say thanks for the presentation, and thanks to Helen Daughter for providing psychological foresight for us.
Yeah, great job, Helen's Daughter. Psychological foresight is very important.
All right, thank you very much. Those of you who asked your questions in the chat, I got dropped out from the meeting, so I was unable to see your question, but we'll get to those questions first on Thursday. But as we come to close our session tonight, I would just like to extend a very heartfelt thank you to Dr. Fletcher for his enlightening presentation on the impacts of climate change. Your knowledge and your leadership has provided us with a deeper understanding of the challenges we face, and we are extremely grateful for the valuable insight that you have shared with us tonight. And for those who have attended this session tonight, I just want to say thank you so much, because your presence has demonstrated a strong commitment, as well as making these sessions very successful. So just thank you very much, and do have a wonderful afternoon, and see you guys on Thursday.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Fletcher.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you, Dr. Fletcher. Good morning.
Good night, everyone, and thank you very much.
Good night, everybody. Good session.
Good night,
Dr.
everyone.